Hello and welcome to the Supernatural Fandom Track here at Continual. I'm your host, Gail Z. Martin, and tonight we're talking about father figures. But before we dive into that, I'd love to let my panelists introduce themselves to you, and starting with Susan.
Hey, I am Susan Griffith. I am usually of a writing team of Clay and Susan Griffith, but he is not here tonight. But we are the authors of Vampire Empire, Crowning Key series, historical fantasies mainly, with a lot of media tie-ins, and I would have loved to have done a supernatural media tie-in, but perhaps someday. That's still on the docket. And that is my story. Can't wait to talk about supernatural and father figures.
Great. Carole?
I am a longtime fan and a fan fiction writer. I've been here since about season 3 and well entrenched into fandom, and I always have something to say about something.
Beth?
Hi, I'm Beth Dolgner. I write paranormal fiction and nonfiction, and I am really excited about this topic tonight. This is something I've wanted to discuss for a very long time.
Awesome. Keith?
I'm Keith RA DeCandido. I have written supernatural media tie-in novels, 3 of them, in fact. The first one, Nevermore, the third one, Bone Key, and the fourth one, Heart of the Dragon. I've been following Supernatural since roughly the mid-first season, and stuck with it through to the bitter end. I've also done a few other bits and pieces of Supernatural stuff here and there. Plus, I've written a whole lot of other stuff. Supernatural is one of over 30 licenses I've worked in. Plus, I have original fiction set in the fictional cities of Super City and Cliff's End, and in the somewhat real locales of New York City and Key West. So.
And I'm Gail Z. Martin, and Morgan Bryce. As Gail, I write epic fantasy, urban fantasy, steampunk, near future, post-apocalyptic, and more. And as Morgan Bryce, I write urban fantasy, male paranormal romance. One of the things that holds true for all of my modern fiction under either name is that they're pretty much worlds that Sam and Dean could walk into and feel right at home. So, well, let's dive into this whole messy father figure thing. And let's start with the grandfathers. Start with Henry, because we know maybe the least about him. But in his brief appearance, what do you think? Come on, somebody jump in.
It was an interesting notion. I mean, we didn't really know anything about him before he showed up. Mm-hmm. Part of me thinks that it would have been more effective if we'd known anything about him before that appearance, but we were supposed to like accept his entire, backstory as a deadbeat dad who his father didn't think anything of, and find out that backstory was completely wrong, all in the same episode. It added an interesting companion piece to what we found out about the mother's side of the family. Mm-hmm. In the beginning, about which I have a lot to say, because that went into my third supernatural tie-in novel, among other things. But just the fact that it turns out that both of Sam and Dean's parents had this legacy that they didn't even really know about was an interesting little revelation. My biggest issue with the introduction of Henry isn't so much the introduction of Henry in and of itself, but that it led to the whole Men of Letters nonsense, which I frankly could have done without. But except insofar as it gave Sam and Dean a home base, which was nice. But the rest of it, I thought, didn't really work as well as it wanted to. But Henry in and of himself was an interesting character, and it was fascinating to see that he meant well, and that he was, somebody who was also trying to stop demons, and that the legacy does go back, a couple generations on both sides of the family there.
I find it interesting that everybody's perceptions, like Keith was saying, that even John thought of Henry as a deadbeat dad, that he was not around, and that's the same thing that you sort of feel with Sam and Dean about you know, in certain ways, not always in context, that John wasn't always around. Not that he was a deadbeat dad, but in the fact that he was always missing or always absent from their lives. And it seemed like there was some sort of legacy in that you learned something a little bit different about that. Was interesting in how Sam and Dean applied, you know, what they felt towards it, which I thought was really kind of interesting. But
I like how everybody's using the word legacy, and we're not even using it in the official sense of they were legacies. We're just using it in the sense of here is how their history was and carried on, and not even getting into the fact that they were in fact legacies, the product of bloodlines that led them to be able to possess the bunker and utilize its assets and things. Certainly their meeting with Henry and Henry's meeting with them, they were all like completely flabbergasted and like, who the heck are you? And, you know, Henry and his entrenched knowledge, his entrenched viewpoint of how the hunters were, you know, they were Neanderthals versus the men of letters being educated. And, you know, there was all these interesting contrasts set up, and yet they were still all very tied together as legacies, you know, so that was kind of interesting.
How about you, Beth?
I think really, you know, and I know we're going to talk about John in a little bit, but I knowing about Henry, I feel kind of bad for John because I believe that he really loved his children. He just wasn't very good at expressing it and it being a father. And bless his heart, he had no real father figure to look up to himself. So he kind of comes by his failure, honestly, in that department. And so I think we just kind of see this, you know, this unbroken chain of you know, secrets and not really being present for your children.
Yeah, only the Winchesters would meet their grandfather by having him stumble through a time traveling closet.
Of course.
You know, but I agree. I felt bad for John because we don't get any indication in canon of how his mother handled this. Did she think that Henry just skipped out on them? Did, you know, maybe there were unexplained absences in the past because of his work that eroded trust? Did they have a rocky marriage already? Did she, you know, how did she react? Did she become, was she a good parent then for John as a child, or did she, you know, crawl into a bottle or deal dysfunctionally? We don't know. So it may be that John had to raise himself just like Sam and Dean had to pretty much raise themselves. And so, yeah, I thought that was interesting. But the glimpse we get of Henry, he's very likable, if a bit sheltered.
Yeah, cloistered, yeah.
The polite way.
Yeah.
He's kind of got that prep school thing going, which the men of letters generally did. But it seemed like, well, obviously he was willing to die for his grandsons whom he had just met, even though that meant leaving his own son behind. So it's kind of hard not to like the guy, even though we only got one episode with him.
He had decent motives.
Yeah.
Although you wonder what the fallout
and
was.
evil in any respect. So there was that element that you immediately can forgive and want to see him, you know, get past what he's doing, but which Dean did, and Sam. But it's, you know, it's hard to watch that, but it was nice to know that there's going to be some resolution at the end of that.
It's also interesting to note that when we're talking about legacies, that all things being equal, Sam and Dean would never have been part of it. Mary, you know, never told anybody about her past as a hunter. John didn't know about it. The kids didn't know about it. And John grew up in ignorance of his background for the men of letters. And if it hadn't been for what happened to that fateful night when Sam turned 6 months old, they would have, you know, gone on with their lives and not had anything to do with any of this. And it harmed them in some ways. I mean, they were completely, they obviously had a serious destiny there, you know, both not just as hunters and as heirs to the men of letters, but also as the vessels for Lucifer and the Michael sword, and as Chuck's playthings and every other damn thing, and they were completely unprepared for it, at least in part due to what happened with their grandparents.
Well, and it could have been, since we know that Mary was still doing some hunting on the sly after she married John, the hunting may have come up in a different way, and without her death and the way John raised them, they would have been much less well prepared for what happened to them, which might explain why some of the other Sams and Deans in the other universes didn't succeed the way they did. They really had an unusual background.
Yeah, I think that's one of John's legacies, along with Mary's, is that they did prepare their kids. They gave them knowledge, they gave them a network, they gave them everything they needed to survive outside the men of letters. And I think that's an interesting point, that, you know, whether that was something that they did, you know, consciously or you know, at some point did it just fade out, and you know, they made a decision to go this particular route. But it was I think they did prepare the kids specifically for that.
Although then
John raised them as warriors.
Right. And then you also get into the whole questionable side of John being so single-minded about raising them as warriors, that then how good a father was he actually to them?
He was also single-minded in raising them specifically to go after Azazel. There really wasn't much else beyond that. And a lot of this is a byproduct of how the show developed. It wasn't really part of the plan, but there's a lot of crap he didn't tell them. Like the whole idea of I was just looking at some second season episodes again recently, because Ren was on a panel that was talking specifically about the second season of the show. They didn't know that there was a whole network of hunters. Sam and Dean didn't. You know, there's a lot of stuff that John kept from them. He kept from them the fact that vampires were still a thing because Elkins told him that they were gone. There's all these other things going on that they didn't find out about until after John was gone.
Well, John was like very single-threaded, but for Sam and Dean, they're in the broader hunter world, so they're more aware of all the other stuff that's actually going on, you know, and dealing with it. Whereas John's just like, Azazel.
Right. Well, my own take on that was always that John was always conflicted between wanting them to carry on the fight after him and him wanting to keep them out of as much of it as possible, to at least give them a shot at some kind of normalcy.
Well, I kind of,
I didn't say it was good at it.
Yeah. The other thing I always wondered about John keeping them sequestered like that is, since he knew about Azazel, although the boys didn't, is if he feared having them around other hunters, that the other hunters might somehow find out and target them.
Especially
and it was
Sam.
Another way he tried to keep them safe.
Sam with the demon blood.
Yeah.
You know, Dean's pretty straightforward, and you know, is the hunter son they all could want, but you know, he had that secret about Sam and Sam's demon blood and what did that mean in the future, and I think he sequestered them both in an effort to keep them safe, which is like, well, there's the good father part, but also because he didn't want other hunters to ever catch a whiff of what would happened with Sam, you know, because they could turn on him.
Yeah, that's sort of the way I looked at
hunted
it.
rather than hunter.
There's an interesting thing that was actually something the writers kind of got wrong, but it actually plays into John, the characterization of John and how he felt toward Sam. When I was writing my first novel, Nevermore, a friend of mine who was one of the people who told me I needed to watch this show that she liked, works in academia, in college, specifically in financial aid and admissions stuff. And one of the things she told me was that there is absolutely no way that Sam Winchester could have had a full scholarship to Stanford without John Winchester having signed a significant amount of paperwork. The only way that, basically, he had to have had John's support in some way or other in order to have what we were told he had. The only way he couldn't is if he had legally emancipated himself from John. And if he had done that, it would have come up in the show at some point.
Unless he was a gifted forger, which
there you go. I'm like, he just forged it.
Maybe, but it was more interesting to me, the idea that John, even though he vocally didn't support it, that he still did sign the paperwork for precisely what you were just talking about, Carol, about that he's trying to keep Sam, to some extent, to keep Sam safe from everybody else. And, you know, that was John's conflict, was that the conflict between wanting to at least have his kids have a shot at a normal life, even though he knew damn well they wouldn't. And that conflict was always, going back and forth in his own head.
And I think it's unfortunate that John loved his sons and was trying to protect Sam, but he didn't communicate that very well. So Sam wound up being resentful because he didn't understand what John was trying to do for him and how significant it was.
Well, and we know that John checked in on Sam now and again at Stanford, which would suggest that he was more proud and supportive than he may have come across. But this is not a crowd of folks who initially communicated well with words.
Or in the middle, or at the end, or ever.
It's somewhat better at the end. But
yeah, I'll say the 300th episode was probably the best shot at where John actually, said, I love my sons. I'm proud of my sons. You've grown up to be fine men. You've done fine work. I couldn't be more, more proud and all of that kind of stuff. So they got that kind of moment of closure back then. But back at the time when Sam is struggling and wants to break out, John's like, don't come back. I spent all your money on ammo. He was, here's the Marine side of him where it's my way or the highway. And he spent the boys' entire childhood raising them that way so that they would obey him when it counted, that in order to stay safe. If he said jump, they had to jump so the werewolf wouldn't get them, and they had to shoot and they had to, do all of that stuff. But it raises a lot of conflict in terms of anybody, any kids are going to want to at some point. Dean didn't, but Sam did, and that was the more normal response, where they're going to want to rebel. They're going to want to choose their own path.
Or just separate from the parent to be an individual, which is what you're normally shooting for as a parent to prepare them to do. That is, you don't want the failure to launch where they're, still 30 years old living in your basement. And in this case, they're close to 40 living in a basement with their mom. But
it was a really big, fancy basement.
A big basement.
Yes, and with a nice car.
Yes. So in that sense, Sam wasn't even as much rebelling as he was going through a normal, healthy stage of maturing. So yeah, where Dean kind of lagged on that a little bit with the over-identification with John for a while, until he decided his dad was an obsessed bastard. Before we get further into John, let's back up and talk about Samuel Campbell. Who wants to dive in on that one?
My viewpoint on Samuel Campbell was he was a better father than a grandfather. I feel he genuinely adored Mary. He was raising her in the life, but once again, safety, carry on the good work. But, by the time he lost her and died and then came back, he didn't give, a rat's behind for really his grandsons, which we find out later when he's ready to throw them under the bus and trade him in to get his daughter back. So father, okay. Grandfather,
That was such a blown opportunity. I was so looking forward to seeing Mitch Pileggi come back, just because I'm a huge fan of Mitch Pileggi's.
Yes.
And I thought it would be, and they just totally botched that entire storyline. Because the person we saw in the beginning was an interesting nuclear family of hunters. I loved the idea, and I got to play with it in Heart of the Dragon. My third supernatural novel, a third of the book takes place in 1969 with the Campbell family going to San Francisco to hunt a monster. And that was so much fun doing, the husband, the wife, and the teenage daughter all going off and doing their thing to fight this monster. And And that was a really neat idea. And Pileggi in particular just did such a good job of playing Samuel.
Yeah. He did.
And I mean, you can see there's a lot of Dean in him, you know, a lot of and there was just so much potential there that got completely flushed away when they brought him back. But I agree with what Carole said. I mean, he obviously was a very good father. I mean, yes, he brought his daughter. I mean, his version of Take Your Daughter to Work Day was pretty brutal, but it prepared her, you know, and she was good at it.
Well, he's a man who makes those hard choices. He's not afraid to make a hard choice, and unlike a lot of others who kind of waffle, he goes straight to the heart of the matter, and he will make the hard decision in where no one else can. And that's both a good thing and a bad thing in regards to being a father figure or a grandfather figure. He's very protective, and you can see that with him, with Mary, and with John, and with everybody. It's just a matter of if something has to be done, he's going to do it, and it's a hard thing to take in, either as a watcher, as a viewer, and as a family member. It makes it very hard to really warm up to him, just because he's that much of a hardline individual.
Beth, what about you?
I don't think I can really add to what Carole said. I mean, I think that, you know, we see these protective tendencies in these fathers, and they're trying really hard and maybe don't quite get it right all the time.
The thing that occurred to me thinking about all of this is that, given the time period, Samuel would have been the World War II generation. So unless he was exceptional for his cohort, he would have been one of those strong, silent, I don't really know how to use words, but I'll show you I love you, and bring home the bacon and defend the family kind of guy. Short on saying what he feels. He should have been a Winchester. But very typical of his generation. And I think we kind of see him acting that way in the original, in the time travel episodes, where you got to kind of see him on his home turf. That struck me, having grown up with the World War II generation, that struck me as very real and authentic.
And you know, to your point, Gail, I really appreciate that with these characters, they are so realistic and they are so flawed. And I think that's so much better than if we got, you know, Dad of the Year and John Winchester or in any of them, because it's so much more relatable. So yeah, the show has a bunch of monsters and ghosts and things, but it's still so very relatable on a human level.
Well, and we saw early John in those flashback, those time travel episodes, who despite everything, and despite having, you know, survived a brutal tour of duty in Vietnam, because there really wasn't any other kind, he came back and he was such a cool guy in the beginning that we saw with him and with Mary, and welcoming the boys in, and that wonderful scene with Sam where he finds out that Sam's father raised him in the life, and he just goes off on what kind of an asshole would do this, you know, and Sam's just sitting there like, what do I say? That was such a terrific episode where that had to mean something to Sam, to see that before the tragedy, the John who wasn't traumatized yet by life would have felt that way. I thought that was so meaningful in kind of seeing who John became.
Well, we can see from the get-go, like how soft he is, both in the time travel when he's their first meeting and he buys you know, Dean a cup of coffee and stuff, but also at the very first episode, and you know, here's Dean running to his daddy, and his daddy's doing the lifting thing, and you know, talking to the baby, and all of this stuff, and he's completely, you know, the warm, loving dad, you know, anybody could want. But it sets us up for that contrast that then post Flambe Mary, you have like, you know, this is it, and everything is about the fighting, and you know, leads to a lot of his more questionable decisions and qualities, which I'm sure we're going to get into a little bit. But you know, from the get-go, he was all about loving his wife, loving his sons, having a family life. It was all he wanted, you know.
Which makes his change so much sadder and bittersweet.
Exactly. It sets it up for that, you know,
And-
really, really dramatic contrast.
And like Gail was saying, Sam doesn't remember that. You know, he
Mhm.
has no memory because he was an infant. While Dean, even as a youth, he might have some gleam in remembering aspects of that, but it's probably so overshadowed by what happened after the transformation, after
Right.
Mary's death, that it
Right.
may not be something that he consciously remembers as well as he remembers everything else. But you know, so that makes it kind of really bittersweet for the family, knowing John was actually a good, kind-hearted soul. So
Yeah.
Mhm. Well, and I think that's the way Jeffrey Dean Morgan played him in Lebanon, where for Jeffrey Dean Morgan, it was what, 2006 or 2004. It was before Sam came back. And so he didn't have the benefit of the last 15 years to grow into this. And yet he found his words. He was able to finally tell both boys that he loved them and he was proud of them and how much that meant to them. And then we saw his reaction to getting Mary back. And it was I thought that was just such an amazing episode and such a terrific insight into John. Because then at the end, he goes back, he wakes up in his car, he thinks it's all a dream, and yet he was capable of that, even at that time.
Mhm.
Keith, did you have something to add on that?
Not, not to that particular point. I think John is an interesting. What's especially interesting is the number of times he asked the kids to do horrible things. Because I'm reminded of something from, actually, of all things, a Buffy the Vampire Slayer episode. There was when we found out that there was one of the previous Slayers had a kid. The one Spike fought on the subway. I actually wrote a whole tie-in novel about her also, and I just hit a filing cabinet for no good reason. Sorry about that. And Nikki's thing to her son Robin is, it's the mission that matters, and that was John. Everything was about the mission, starting with probably the most important sentence in the sentence that defined Dean Winchester's life, which is when he says, you know, take your brother outside as fast as you can. Don't look back. Now, Dean, go. That's Dean's life right there. That those two sentences that John said to him when he was 4 or 5 years old, whatever. And then later, you know, when you know, basically his dying wish to Dean was, oh, by the way, you're probably going to have to kill your brother.
FYI.
Yeah. And just all the different, you know, all the things he left out, that information that they could have used, that he didn't tell them about the community of hunters, about any number of things that they had to figure out on their own because John didn't tell them. The fact that he had an entire, you know, relationship and a kid that they didn't know about. And I can't imagine that's the only time he snuck off and did something, you know, non-huntery while he left Sam and Dean with Bobby or whoever. You know, this and one of the reasons why I had thought that it made sense that he supported Sam, at least on some level, was there was one episode, and I forget which one it was. It was the Brian Markinson was the actor who played him, but it was a guy who was an air traffic controller. It was the one where we found out that Dean can't fly. He mentioned that the last time he'd seen John was going on at great length about how proud he was of Sam, his son, who's at Stanford. And Sam was like, the hell? What? And that this was a really conflicted character. And he never really resolved the conflict between the guy who wanted to revenge for the death of his wife and the guy who wanted the best life for his kids.
Well, and I think
that conflict killed him.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, Winchesters were terrible at, when they did try to put things into words, not doing it very well. I mean,
Yeah.
Sam screwed that up, Dean screwed that up. But I always thought when John said, if you can't save him, you'll have to kill him, I always heard it that actually was putting the burden of saving him on Dean more than the burden of killing him. If you screw this up and you can't save him, Dean, you're going to have to kill him. So don't F it up. And taking that first part of the clause as a burden and really offloading it onto Dean to, hey, you screw this up, he's dead, so you better not. Which is
both ways are
Winchester
horrible.
speak.
Yeah.
Both ways are so horrible. They put so much stress on Dean. You wonder how these people function without medical help.
Well, we wonder that anyhow.
Lots of liquor and one night stands.
That's true. That is their medicine.
Well, let's talk about Dean as a father figure to Sam, certainly, and to Ben. How'd he do?
So I just watched that episode this week, and I was noticing how when some kids had stolen Ben's little video game, and Dean was like, well, you got to go over there and stand up for yourself. And so when Ben goes over and basically beats up the kid, Dean's like, yeah, that's my boy, there you go. And I thought, maybe we don't want him being a father, because he, we said he was basically raised as a warrior, and so he may have raised his own child the same way. So maybe it's better that Dean didn't have a big, huge family and lots of kids running around, because I don't know that he would have been necessarily very responsible with the way he raised them.
I don't think it's not that he's not responsible. I think that he just never really saw himself as a father figure. And so he still treats, when he's doing these things, he still thinks of himself as, 30-year-old fun-loving Dean, and he makes mistakes unconsciously. But I think you see him slowly start to grow, because you see him all the way through to when he's dealing with Jack, that he has grown. He has seen that there are some aspects to being a father, even though he's certainly starting to see, well, maybe this is what being a father is really like, not what he started out with. Because I think with him, and that's what the show does so beautifully, is it gives you those character arcs, those growths, where you see Dean's flub it with Ben, and yet you see him slowly evolving by testing it out on Sam and testing it out on what's their names, Alex and
Claire,
the mini golf thing. I mean, you see him trying, and then he's much better with Jack. So it's like a learning process for that boy.
well, and actually, when he was raising Sam with only the 4-year age difference between them, if a kid beat up Sam in school and Sam didn't take care of it, it wasn't that out of the box for his older brother to come, give the kid a come to Jesus lesson. With only that's different than a 30-year-old guy beating up a kid. And I'm not sure, to Susan's point, that Dean had transferred out of that headspace when he was trying to parent Ben. He was always Sam's brother, even when he was parentified to also be his caretaker and his guardian.
I also just want to mention,
but he always acted more like, sorry, go ahead, Karen.
well, just that first encounter with Ben, where he tells Ben, go over and kick him and get your game back. Yeah, it's just like a very direct kind of, here's a problem, let's solve it, which is very Dean, point A, point B, boom. When he goes and actually really becomes his quasi stepfather, I think at that point he takes it much more seriously. Now he's really invested. The first time is really just kind of like, here's a kid in trouble, I'm going to tell him what to do, But when he's really been stepfather, that year he spends with Lisa, he's much more like, hey, and we're working on the truck, and we're doing the sports, and we're doing all this stuff. And he took it more seriously and more adulty, let's say, than he did in that first, go punch him. And I think Dean's also had a gift that he might say, I don't really know about kids, I don't really know how to deal with them. But what Dean did is he never talked down to the kids. He talked to kids on a level peer-to-peer basis, which not all adults do. Like even if you go back to Dead in the Water, is that it? Dead in the Water?
Yeah.
And Lucas, and he just goes over and he just starts talking to Lucas, and he's not like, hey, I mean, he doesn't baby talk him and he doesn't coddle him. He's just like, you know what? My mom died too and it sucked, you know, and he just talks to them, and he does that all the way through with any kids that he deals with. And the kids respond to that. They really respond to that because they're like, hey, this person's not talking down to me. They're just treating me like a person.
In a lot of ways, Dean, the way Dean was with Ben felt more like an older brother or the cool uncle than it was his father in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But you're right, Carol. He also, and I like that about him. I mean, I try to do that. I teach karate to kids, and I always try to talk to them, even if they're, incredibly crazy 4-year-olds. I still try to talk to them the same way I would to the adults. I just, they're not kids, they're people. And kids do it, absolutely respond to that. And that's a good parenting ploy, which probably, unfortunately, was born out of the fact that he had to, be Sam's father figure when he was 8. And he had to act like an adult when he was 8. So as far as he's concerned, other 8-year-olds should be able to act like that too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, most of the time when we see a situation on TV where you've got an older sibling who has to take care of younger siblings, and I'm thinking of like Lilo and Stitch, you've got a big age gap between the characters, where one's already a teenager, or maybe it's a group of children and the oldest steps up to take care, but they're a teenager on down. And as she said, Dean was 8 to Sam's 4. That's a whole different kind of thing.
Although to the 4-year-old, 8 is still impossibly old.
It is, and having raised kids to the 8-year-old, they thought they were 30. Nobody knows more than an 8-year-old teaching the meaning of life to their 4-year-old sibling.
Especially at that point, the actual father, John, is practically deferring to Dean. It's not even like when John is around, he takes over. He still is like, take care of your little brother, whether I'm here or not. Certainly when I'm not, but you know what? Even when he's there, it's like, feed Sam, bathe Sam, take Sam to school, do this, do that.
Like he's his mother,
Exactly.
his father at that point. And it isn't until later that you see him start to become a father figure. But when they're kids, it's
right. He nurtures him.
He's nurturing.
He knows that how Sam likes his macaroni and cheese and what he needs in order to go to sleep and where's his binky and, all of that kind of very nurturing stuff, which is where Dean has that under his crusty facade of, hot babes and cold liquor.
His macho posturing.
He's got that very whooshy, inside.
So there's another one I definitely want to slide in here before we run out of time, and that is Jimmy Novak and Claire and Cass and Jack. So we've got some interesting father stuff going on there. Let's start with Jimmy and Claire. Here's a guy who decides to give himself over to the angels. Screw the family. Not sure how that factors into being an extremely holy person, but I always thought that was a conflict. Walk out on your family to serve God. Your mileage may vary. What do you think? Claire really has a chip on her shoulder, and I can't blame her. Thoughts?
I would too.
Ross, take away.
It's certainly in keeping with the entire theme of Supernatural from season 4 or so onward, which is that the angels are all dicks. And only slightly better than the demons, really.
If that. The demons
well,
were
at least the angels at least ask permission.
Yeah, this is true.
Marginally.
The angels understand about consent.
Not that they still don't abuse it.
Granted.
I.e. Zachariah and, the whole Sam, Sam and Dean in the
Sandos.
Thank you.
Yes.
But
I'm with you, Gail. I never liked the whole idea that somebody shows their devotion by abandoning their family and on one hand, yes, you're giving yourself up for something greater than yourself, which
But
in the abstract can be very noble, but if you're leaving a wife and kid behind, and worse, leaving a wife and kid behind, but your meat sack is wandering around with your face and your voice, that's just cruel.
Mhm.
and
Did
no
he know that was going to
explanation.
happen though?
And no explanation either. He just walks out the door.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I've said before with the show, I think the worst part is when the monsters turn out just to be humans. And I think there's a little bit of that going on with Jimmy Novak. You know, this fanaticism of his just really ruins, you know, the lives of everyone that he's claimed to love, and that's scary.
I
Mhm.
think his best moment is when Castiel goes into Claire, and he's like, no, and he's like, take me, I don't want her to go through this, you know, and at that point he's actually doing a much more father-like thing where he's like, hurt me, take me, not my child, you know. It saves her for the moment, but it doesn't save her kind of down the pike, so to speak, you know, the
And
damage.
it doesn't obviate the original thing, which was Jimmy
No,
volunteering to
not at
the first
all,
place.
not at all. You know, it's just that one, that's his one shining moment.
Yeah, right.
After that, forget it. So
So what about Cass and Jack? Because Cass certainly took the idea of not being the biological father, but the responsibility of fatherhood.
All three of them
Serious.
did really to some extent, but yeah.
Pardon?
All three of them did to some extent.
Yeah,
But,
yeah.
I mean, the show really did turn into My Three Dads there at the end.
Mhm.
Um,
2 men and a baby.
3 men and a Jack.
yeah. Three men and
and
an Antichrist, yes.
Um, but it was interesting watching Cass try to parent Jack when he had no firsthand knowledge of human parenting, and he was kind of a fish out of water to begin with. But he tried,
And he succeeded in some ways. You know, I mean, there was some elements to him in terms of, you know, he was what Jack needed at that particular moment, whether he was doing it right or wrong. I think he did it completely by accident sometimes. It wasn't really that he was thinking clearly that I'm a father figure. He wanted to be a father figure, but he clearly had no idea what that entailed, like Gail said. But I think Jack needed that at that particular moment in time, perhaps.
well, Cass also had a absent father.
Yeah.
Yeah. And given where Jack wound up, you can argue that he did a pretty good job considering his son basically grew up to be the Almighty, which, you know, hey.
He
Nice
much
goal there.
2.0 than Chuck.
Right.
I feel so much though that there's so much of Sam and Dean in that as well. Like I think
yeah.
if it had just been Cass, that they wouldn't have gotten to that point. But I think
Jack would have been staring at the bees
yeah,
Yes.
or eating nougat.
and sandwiches.
Yeah,
deadpanning
but
along.
you know, Sam taught him how to function like in the real world. Sam taught him about, you know, real things and what it meant to move through life. And then Dean, like, really, let's not forget, in the beginning, Dean didn't want anything to do with Jack. He was very like, I don't want to deal with him. I don't want to talk with him. This is not my problem. You guys want to do it? Be my guest, you know. But when he finally did, he was more like I don't want to say the rough and tumble, but he's more like, sometimes you got to do the tough things, and here's how you do them. So he had that kind of aspect, and Sam had the more, in this case, that nurturing thing, kind of like Dean had when Sam was little. And I feel like Cass was a little bit more of like, let's learn how to set our moral compass so we don't like destroy the earth, you know.
He got the best out of all three of them. He got exactly.
Yeah, he got the best of all
things out
three
of
of them.
each.
And because of that distillation, we got the ending we got,
Yeah.
where, you know,
Yeah.
it was all.
And
Yeah.
what you're describing, I just realized, Carol, is that what you're describing is Dean, once again, being the big brother / cool uncle to Jack.
Mhm.
Yes. Yep.
In a
Yep.
lot of ways. Because
Sam was more the mom,
that's his wheelhouse right there.
Yeah. Don't
Yeah.
tell Sam. What was it? He came out one time. He's like, "Don't tell Sam I'm eating like the Lucky Charms, or the sugary cereal." You know. So yeah, it was kind of their version of the Holy Trinity, I guess.
I guess. Yeah.
Can't do
Well, I
father
think you could
figures.
argue it's the best fathering on the show, and their success, I mean, literally the world depended on it. So
Yeah.
when it counted, they stepped up.
Well, we can't do father figures without talking about Bobby.
Yes. The prototypical character who was only supposed to be in one episode who practically took over the show. Yes.
Right.
Yeah, he adopted 2 boys and they turned out to be heroes.
They turned out to
Yeah.
be heroes.
He was the surrogate father and it worked.
He has so many interesting little bits about him because I think he did grow as the show went on. It wasn't like they were like, here's how he's going to be. It was like, oh, he's this. Oh, he speaks Japanese. Oh, he answers, he has a phone bank. So there's always these new little facets to discover. Bobby's one of those characters where what happens in canon and what happened in fanon, you kind of have to keep them straight, because in fanon, Bobby's really their substitute father. But in canon, that's not really the case. Bobby didn't raise them. They saw him, but it was really almost more as they were older and they were hunting that they got to really develop that relationship. They had their moments, like when we had that flashback when he's teaching, he says, Dean, I will take the day off from the shooting range. Let's go throw a baseball, But at that point, those boys were still in John's control.
He was at the very least an occasional babysitter.
Exactly. But then as they grew older and they came to work with him more as peers, that's when you had more of that relationship develop, and he grew very fond of it in there, and that certainly, absolutely, the love and like the way that Dean is holding on to that flask after Bobby passes away, and all of that is the love is,
he was the stability.
Yeah, absolutely. And he was
which
the
is what they
unconditional affection that they could never get from their actual father, but there's sometimes you gotta, even with John, just to hark back to him for a second, where we know that he was neglectful, he was a drunk, but when you get into fanon, you get like a whole new range of,
John Winchester's A+ parenting.
Right. Yes. Yes, that famous AO3 tag, John Winchester's A+ parenting. So with John and again with Bobby, you kind of have to make sure you're sifting out what really happened on screen versus what we sometimes develop thinking about happening.
But he also, it's fascinating to me, the difference between how Bobby and John, their differing reactions to, both of them had this, basically got started in hunting the same way with something happening to the woman they loved. John's reaction was to turn into a crazy man. And Bobby's reaction was to go out and learn everything he possibly could. Bobby also, and this always I thought was very important, Bobby continued to run his business.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
One of the things that drove me absolutely bonkers about this TV show from jump is I never understood how Sam Dean and John fed, clothed, and housed themselves ever. Especially driving a freaking 67 Impala at a time when gas was $4 a gallon.
That's a lot of poker.
Yeah. Bobby had a business, and a business that's never likely to go out of business. People always need automobile salvage. But he also was a knowledge base. His reaction, his response wasn't just to become a hunter, it was to become the smartest hunter he could possibly be. And he still had the mental stability to be the father, to be, the babysitter for Sam and Dean when it was necessary, to help out other hunters where necessary, to be the pretend FBI deputy director or whatever for their disguises, and do all that and become, this person that other people could rely on, which is a much better role model for pretty much every hunter, not just Sam and Dean.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I posit that in John's case, he was thrust into hunting because of what happened to him. And in Bobby's case, it kind of happened to him, but he also had to take control of it because he had to kill Karen.
Yeah.
And he had to kill his abusive father. So there, Bobby took control of destiny in a way that John never was able to. And I wonder if that helped play into the fact that he was like, I can't do everything, but I am going to know everything I can, because of the way those circumstances shaped him.
I just loved in particular when we finally got Bobby's backstory, the way that he phrased it, which was that I didn't know what to do. And just the plaintiveness of the way Jim Beaver delivered that line. I loved that. I love the idea that his thirst for knowledge and for information is what drove him to, in essence, become the hunter's librarian.
I was just going to say, he is the well that everybody draws from. And that's, and because he's got a business, because he stays in one spot, he's not this wanderer that everybody else has become. He becomes that stability that almost every hunter has to rely on, but Sam and Dean more than ever. Yeah. And it's that gradual growth to them that they become that close. And because, again, I think it's because he is stable. He is that rock in that turbulent water that they can always run to, cling to for a moment to take a breath, which is, again, gives them their sanity back that's missing from a lot of hunters' lives.
Particularly in the immediate aftermath of John's death.
Yeah.
Right. Beth, anything to add to that?
Yeah, this is going to sound silly. I like it when Bobby yells at the boys. And I say that because a lot of times you see John yelling at them and it's just pure anger. But when Bobby does it, he's obviously doing it because he cares about them so much and he wants them to be safe and he wants them to make the right choices. And so I feel like when he's yelling at them, it's because he loves them so very much. And you can tell the way Jim Beaver does it, you can tell that there's just so much heart behind all of that. And I always like it when they're in trouble with him because it's for a good reason.
Also, it's always funny whenever he yells at him.
Yeah. I'm flashing back on Tall Tales, when they both have their separate stories of what's happening, and he's just like, oh my God, he just wants to knock their heads together. So yeah.
Which brings us to Sam's chance to be a father. What do you think?
With Mrs. Blurry Woman.
with Mrs. Blurry and with Blurry Baby Mama and Dean Jr.
We only saw it for like 10 minutes.
I think it's clear he was very involved, though. I think. Oh yeah. There's the ball throwing, there's the homework. We got those little snippets, but also, I think Sam would look at his being raised, and take the good stuff from what Dean did and leave everything else. Like, how would he, what would he have wanted? This is what he would have wanted. He would have wanted someone, Dean, I'm sure, tried to help him with his homework. And, they never had a chance to throw a ball because John wouldn't give them a ball.
I'm pretty sure Sam helped Dean with his homework more often.
Yeah. So, so I think for him, this was a real chance to give a life that he never got to have, and build that life for his son.
Yeah, I think there was an ideal that he had in his mind, and he was finally able to fulfill that. But really, after you've helped raise the kid that goes on to become God, I mean, maybe helping a kid with his math homework is not that hard. But yeah, I think Sam was probably a really wonderful father, especially because he knew the value of family and knew how much it hurts to lose family. So I think he probably was really just a very attentive, very caring father.
Susan, any thoughts on that?
It's not an episode that I was familiar with. Like I said, I had some gaps in some of my viewing, and that must have been one of them. So I'm sad to say that I missed that episode. I'm going to have to go.
What was the last
one?
That's the series finale.
See, I have to go look at that one. I haven't watched those last couple of episodes. I'm trying to get through the last.
Spoilers.
It's all right. I'm good with that. I'm okay with that. I expected that.
Well, folks, I think we could talk about this for another hour, but we're actually at the end of our time. So thank you all for a terrific discussion. I'm sure after we end the call, we'll all think of, and then there was, and so, of course that's going to happen. But before we wrap up, let's go around and tell everybody where they can find you online, starting with you, Susan.
Online, you can find us at clayandsusangriffith.com. You can find us on Twitter as Clay and Susan. We each have our own special personal accounts as Susan Griffith and as Clay Griffith. And I think we're on same thing with Facebook. So you can find us pretty much anywhere, but reach out and you can get samples and everything at the website and reach out to us from there as well.
Awesome. Carol?
I'm so wrapped up in the discussion still. I'm on Twitter as true_firesign10. All my fiction is on AO3 as firesign10. That's the number 10. Mind the tags.
Okay. And Beth?
Probably the easiest place for me is bethdolgner.com, and all of my social media links are on there.
Cool. Keith?
You can find me at DeCandido, that name right there, DeCandido.net. It's a glorified link dump and not a particularly sophisticated one, but it'll lead you to my Facebook page, my blog, my Twitter feed, my Instagram, my Wikipedia entry. I also write about pop culture for Tor.com, mostly about either Star Trek or live action adaptations of superhero comic books. That's just sort of what I wound up writing a lot about. I'm currently doing a Star Trek Voyager rewatch, and I've been reviewing things like Falcon and Winter Soldier and other stuff for that site. And you can find my books on all your whatever your online dealer of choice is. Just look up my name and you'll find my books. So.
You can find me at gailzmartin.com and morganbryce.com. Social media, put in those names and you're going to find me on all of the platforms. I also am now a staff columnist for the Winchester Family Business blog on Supernatural and Walker. And of course, you can find me here at Continual. So thank you very much to all of our wonderful panelists for a great conversation tonight. And thank all of you for watching and listening. There'll be more Supernatural here on Continual. So we'll see you online.